You're listening to Slick Talk, the hospitality podcast, a podcast for those who are in and around the hospitality industry who love, live, and breathe what they do. You can join us for candid and unscripted conversations with hospitality experts and founders as we go deeper into their personal stories while they're sharing their triumphs and trials that got them to where they are today. I'm your host, Will Slickers, and you're listening to an episode of Slick Talk, the hospitality podcast. Now, let's begin. All right, Slick Talkers. I don't know how to say this, like every episode is just so special and it's so fun. And this one is more exciting for me than not because at the end of the day, we've had this amazing guest on the podcast before. She's a Destination Air Award winner from back when we actually did the awards. We're still doing them, BT Dubs. I got a couple questions and we're just not going to make it a yearly thing. We're going to make it special. And so this is super fun because not only from the time that I met this guest in Miami, she has just blossomed with her own business. She's left her 9 to 5. She's still managing her 4 properties. Now she's putting on her own event. So, Catherine Ratcliffe, welcome back to the podcast. So excited to have you on. You've been busy.
Thank you so much for having me back, Will. I appreciate it. I have been busy. It's true.
I
Very
thought
much.
I had a problem saying no, but apparently it sounds like you also get an idea and you just start running. And it's super exciting. That's why I love you. It's why we get to connect. And I love our conversations at conferences and just within our network and circles, right? And so let's talk about CanStays. So tell the listeners what's going on in Canada. Why are you putting on this event? And we'll go from there.
All right. So the first thing to know is that I'm originally from Canada. I grew up in Ottawa, capital of the country, not Toronto. A lot of people think it's Toronto, but it's not. It's Ottawa. And I moved to Florida a while ago, but I've always stayed very close because I've got family and friends. And when you grow up in Ottawa, it's, sort of like growing up in a DC bubble, like everybody kind of spreads out. And it's very common for people to, have very interesting jobs after that. So I moved here and I still stayed connected with all of the things that were going on regulatory wise. It was always intertwined. And so when I went to that first conference at the Book Direct conference in Miami, where I first met you, I ran into some Canadians and it really struck me because that it's just everything is different. Mortgages are different, inflation, like everything is so different up there with the way that it works. But I just thought, well, it's Miami, it's October, maybe that makes sense. And then I started to meet more and more Canadians as I would go to conferences. And I just thought this is a fairly large outlay between the registration, airfare, hotels, and most of the content's not relevant. And so I started asking around, like, why do these Canadians come here? Why don't they go to their own conference? And I found out there was no actual Canadian content conference. And that's sort of a big, like, if there's a soapbox that you get on, it's one of the soapboxes that I get on about Canadian content because it was drilled so much into us growing up. And when we would deal with regulatory stuff on the insurance side, and people would talk about, importing Canadian drugs, that type of thing. I'm like, if it's not got both languages, then it's not the same, right? You've got all these language regulations and all the rest of it. So it may not be a Canadian drug. And so I just couldn't understand how they could justify coming in and then not get the ROI in terms of how do you market properly if you're in Canada? What are the different customer profiles? Because they're very different when you start looking at the way people travel across the country. It's such a big country, but it's smaller from a population perspective. So there's lots of towns where there's no hotel. It's not like you're in competition with a hotel because there is nothing there. And then same for healthcare. My mom had been one of the original nurses at the Children's Hospital of Eastern Ontario in Ottawa, and you would have patients driving 10 hours to get to a hospital. Like we can't, for us in America, that seems strange, and hard to cope with. But that's everyday life. And so I started to just really drill into why can't we do this? And if I can't get a good answer as to why we can't, then that means I must be being called to do it. So I'm doing it.
Well, the same man, it sounds like you guys really had to plan having a baby in Canada if you gotta drive 10 hours to get to a hospital. That's like, you gotta be like, "Hey, this baby is not coming early. We are going on this time, this date. This is when we're getting in the car, and we're hitting the road." Like, it sounds like it was you had to be very
That's the
flexible.
funniest thing is because there's a property manager up in Whitehorse, Neighborly North, and, his name is Ben, and that's part of his marketing, is the number of babies that have been born coming through his short-term rentals because 'cause they're coming in to come into the city that has the hospital, and the first time I read that, I was like, "Wait a second, does he have, like, a short-term rental birthing center?" Like, that seems a really strange, but it's just the accommodations that, before and after kinda thing. So there were these unique opportunities when you start looking at, how do you set yourself apart? What are the key features that you look for from an investment strategy and financing and all of those things? There's some really unique Canadian opportunities. And don't get me wrong, like not everybody has to travel 10 hours to go to a hospital. There's plenty of people that have five hospitals, to choose from, but there's also, some disparity and you may not have a children's hospital or you might not have a cancer center. And so there was just a lot of opportunities that I was like, why is nobody tackling this? And at the same time, as I was having those ideas and those puzzle pieces coming together, regulations started to hit. And so it started with BC coming in and banning short-term rentals in any of the major cities that have, more than 10,000 residents, and you couldn't do anything below 30 days, and they want to push it to 90 days. And then the federal government started announcing that they were going to make budget adjustments to the GST tax deduction. So I was like, this is the content that everybody needs to be able to talk through and strategize all the reasons you go to a conference to learn best practices, build relationships, and say, hey, how did you deal with that situation? That wasn't happening. And at best, you were getting it in a Facebook group, but a Facebook group is not the same as that face to face conversation.
Definitely, and it's crazy, to me because Canada and America are so close in sense of, like, border and proximity, but yet we're so different from government to all the things you've mentioned. And it is wild. We had Jamie Lane monthly on Good Morning Hospitality. That's his permanent slot. We're never getting rid of him. And he was talking about the hospital thing. You did get it a little bit wrong, and you did correct me when we were chatting about this episode in the sense of there are hospitals, but they're more or less not common in every city. But how is the hospital system super impacted? The way short-term rentals, so we had even people commenting on the live show being like, "Oh, there's no hotels and there's only X amount of hospitals. Great, I'm gonna buy like 30 short-term rentals near a hospital and start." But was it children's hospitals specifically is what you're talking about?
No, I mean, you've got people that come from the north that in those communities, there's legitimately like there's no hospital. I think what he had said was there was no there were provinces that had no hospitals. I don't
Gotcha.
that's
Yeah.
there are hospitals in every province, but it may be that there might not be a children's hospital that you can go to. Like specifically when you look at, Saskatchewan or some of the prairie provinces, and then some of the Maritimes, if you need like a really specialized cancer treatment center, you might be traveling a significant way. And so what's uniquely different about that is, in the US, we're so focused on the insurance component and having worked on insurance plans so much, if you had to travel a certain distance, the insurance company paid for that. And in Canada, the provinces pay for your accommodations if you have to travel a certain amount. And so when you start getting into things like what's happening in BC, because BC has some great hospitals in Vancouver, and among other places. And that's where when you tap into how do I find the win-win in an advocacy conversation, it can be with how are the rural residents going to access this healthcare system if they have something like cancer or a kidney transplant where they're very immunocompromised and they can't be in, a Hampton Inn and mixing over coffee and breakfast in the morning. Like they need to be in a place where they're safe from picking up any bacteria. And those were the conversations that it was like, oh, wait a second. I didn't think about that part. And what about the displaced people that, and again, my daughter flooded my house. So I speak from experience here. If you have to move out and the insurance company is paying for that, it's a lot more expensive to send you to a hotel and pay for all your meals and boarding your dog and all the rest of it versus finding a short term rental. And a displaced person could just as easily happen in a city that has more than 10,000 residents as a more rural place. So what does that person do? And what's that trickle down effect in terms of course, I live in Florida. So the sensitivity to what happens to property insurance for the whole, those things can become very sensitive components about, like, oh, yeah, we didn't think about that. And what happens with new Canadians that maybe can't get approved for either a mortgage or a long term lease. And even people who might get theoretically approved from a credit rating perspective, they might not be able to afford a long-term lease. And so there's been stories about people that are going from short-term rental to short-term rental because that they can afford and it includes all the utilities and all of that sort of thing. So I think everybody acknowledges that there are problems, but how do we get a seat at the table to say we can be the solution to some of these problems? Not all of them. And yes, regulations important. You don't want to have 27 people in a one bedroom apartment, but where's the balance and how do we tell the story? And nobody was telling the story for Canada. And that's an event planning issue at that point. You know, you plan the event and you invite the people to come in and tell their story, and they're amazing, but they're uniquely Canadian. They're not American stories.
Yeah, and it is very hard because I think, you and I both have attended many conferences. We're at the same ones most of the time, from STR Wealth to, Book Direct to VRMA to all the other things. Level up your listing, even though you didn't get to make it because you're putting on your own. I know, but we
Bought a
we
ticket
miss
though.
you. We miss
Yeah.
you. We're all at these things, and it is pretty interesting. And I think in the last year, I've noticed more Canadians at these conferences, and it's funny because there is like such a big difference that you are kind of like, okay, well, maybe there's not differences in the operation, right? Like you're still cleaning beds, you're still cleaning rooms. Like I think the operational piece, there's not a ton of difference. So we some of the tech stack might be able to transfer over and whatnot, but the overall ecosystem and world of the geographic location is impacting short-term rentals way more differently in Canada than in America. And so I wanna know. I put on my own event. You were there, Book Direct Show. Did it with Damian Sheridan. Shout out to Damian, love you. And, I've also hosted retreats. I've also, helped, with other events behind the scenes. And it's very different when you attend versus when you put it on your own. What's the biggest thing you've learned putting on your own so far? What's made you the most, maybe not nervous, but what was one thing that you didn't expect when you signed up for this, especially in a place that has never had such an event? So, would love to know what's one thing you didn't expect.
Well, the hardest part when you put on an event that's never been put on before is everybody has an opinion about where it should be.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
that's the first thing, right? So that was definitely challenging. It's there's no part of it that's easy, right? You're dealing with two different currencies, you're dealing with two different languages, tax regulations, all of that sort of thing. I think the hardest thing is just when there's never been you have a dichotomy of those that are willing to come into and travel for conferences and those that are like, "What do I get out of a conference?" And
Mhm.
so I think educating people on the value of a face-to-face network event when they haven't been to one before, that's probably been the biggest hurdle. Because those that go to conferences, those that go to events, they were just sort of like, "Well, help me understand what my ROI is on this." And I think especially for the vendor side, because they're used to looking at, well, how many thousands of people are gonna be there? Or how many, how big are the property managers? And I had to reframe a lot of that for them, because like you said, I saw you how many times this past year. And so if you're talking about from a tech stack perspective, how often are you gonna change your property management system or your revenue management? How often are you gonna do that in 1 year? And so this was a shift of, it's a fairly immature market in that for some of these people, they've never been to a conference before. And I think it was a lot of education for the vendors because even on the operational side, like the rules across Canada are so different. So you get into the GTA, like around Toronto, and you've got garbage police. And so what do you do with mandatory composting regulations and mandatory recycling and things that only get picked up every 2 weeks? How do you manage that from an operational perspective? Like what do you do? Because if I showed up at a short-term rental and the garbage was overflowing for the last week of dirty diapers, that would affect my initial impression of the place. But at the same time, if that's how the garbage works there, Like, how do you communicate that to your guests? And those are some of the things that even on an operational perspective, when I was talking to people in the beginning, they're like, "Wait, there's what? What happens with the garbage?" And and it was really interesting. Same with from an emergency perspective and a guidebook perspective, because you get people that say, "Oh, I'm in Alberta, so we don't, yeah, we understand that there's this whole thing with Quebec, but we're in Alberta, and so it's all English speaking." And it's like until you get the travel baseball team or the hockey team or whatever, and you don't have it in French, and it's a real problem, and vice versa in Quebec, where if you don't have it in English, and even if it can pass a regulation, what happens, and I know Justin Ford is very big on talking about the opportunity for incidents. It may not be the law, but what is the standard if you don't have the information in English and somebody, has an issue in your property? So from a public safety perspective, there were a lot of different things that we wanted to cover and say, hey, Canada has its own safety standards that are different because of language regulations, because of some of the garbage related stuff, the carbon strategies that they have from province to province and municipality to municipality. And I think there is often, and I lived there and moved here thinking we were the 51st state, but there is that, assumption that it's like basically like us, but there's a little bit, it's a little different. They like the letter U more than we do, and they've got Quebec and, those types of things. And it's very, very different when you get into the weeds of it, especially when you deal with finance and tax and insurance.
All right, Catherine just talks about the vendor side of the industry, right? It's so different in America and Canada that when it comes to your tech stack, it's actually not transferable. But one of the companies that I want to make sure that you are talking about or hearing from is Hostfully. Hostfully does have a pretty good presence in Canada. I know plenty of operators that use Hostfully from Vancouver, BC, all the way down to Alberta. And so you need to get with Hostfully. There's a special link and offering in our show notes here. Don't let your technology scare you out of operating your business efficiently. And of course, Book Direct, website, branding, Hudson Creative Studio integrates perfectly with Hostfully. They're a great pair. Get them together. They've got amazing special offers in the show notes here. Shout out to Hostfully for being our day one sponsor. You guys are amazing. And of course, if you're an operator in Canada, get with them. If you're not in Canada, still get with them. I know people in Puerto Rico and Costa Rica and Europe that are using them. So get with them because they're with everybody. Hostfully, you rock. Now back to the episode with Catherine as we jump into more information about CanStays. Well, I was going to say, speaking of insurance, this is a great opportunity for us to shamelessly plug your first episode with us on the show. And for anyone who is like, okay, she's talking about this event, right? All this other stuff. You need to go back and hear Catherine's story in the sense of where you come from in the insurance world, also in like the benefits and the other side of employment, right? When you're offering these I don't like the word HR, but when you're basically in HR and you offer employee benefits, like all the things that go and encompass in that, plus everything you've done with your own properties. Shameless plug to you and to our first episode together, basically, is what I'm trying to say. Go back and listen. Link in the show notes, all this good stuff. But you're so right. And it's so crazy to me hearing you say this. My mind is now racing because I'm like, oh, I thought we were Canada was like the 51st state, right? You guys are super. I've been to Vancouver. It's not that much
Yeah.
different. Like it's a maybe a cleaner Seattle, right? Like that was my way of saying it. It was a cleaner Seattle. Steve Davis, I always give him a hard time about his a boot, right? Like he's like, "Oh, it was a boot," yeah. But
Yeah.
that's about it. Like there's not much
Yeah.
difference, but there is actually so much more difference, especially on the eastern side. So uh, this is where I want to talk to you about some things in the sense of content for a conference. I plan content virtually. The conference content line is very different. It's hard to get butts and seats in the sense of getting people to sit through every session. Have you tried to, or are you trying to balance the amount of like networking, conference education, legislation, regulation talk, or like what's your approach going for CanStays?
Yeah, I would say this is the hardest part of it, because it's as if there's 2 conferences in one. So you have the people that are very passionate about advocacy, that want to understand, like, how do we do this? We're scared. Our businesses are on the line. What if this gets rolled out across the country? what do we do? And so we do have big public figures coming. I'm very excited that we have Minister Dominic LeBlanc coming, who's the federal cabinet minister for public safety and intergovernmental affairs, which is great because it gives him a unique position to be able to speak to some of these things. But there are people that just aren't interested in advocacy. It intimidates them. They don't understand it. They don't want to talk to politicians, and they only care about how they can drive more revenue, get more direct bookings, all of the things that you would see at a normal conference. So, what we've tried to do is have pockets of time where if you're not interested in the advocacy component, then that's when you can really network with some of the other folks. We've tried to include evening cocktail receptions where you've got time to network, and some of the, I don't want to say lighter sessions, but sessions where people are like, okay, well, I might skip that session because I want to, like I'm guilty. I bring my laptop to every conference and I just go around and meet with all my vendors. I'm like, hey, here's my problem. I don't want to call your help desk. Here's what I want to do. And so I'm sure there will be people that do that. I've tried to segue it into the different pockets so that because some people have 5, 8 people coming from an organization, and so they have different interests too. So your C-suite versus your operations team, not everybody wants to sit through some of the operation stuff. Not everybody wants to participate in the safety components. And so I've tried to spread it across the 3 days so that there's buckets of time where it's not like this whole day is advocacy or this whole day is safety. And so that you can kind of dip out and network.
Yeah, no, I love that, and I even, love that you made it podcaster friendly for us that wanna attend and record some content. I'm still TBD on my attendance due to my schedule kind of being up in the air for April, but I think, like, the biggest thing I've seen, and I've kind of even mentioned on the show, is getting the content beyond the conference, and, yes, it's great to get people there and in person. I love that aspect because we both said, we're both at all the conferences basically. I also just think that there is a power or a powerful opportunity that is missed by most conferences when you don't have that megaphone to amplify the message or the content outside in the ways that people are normally used to consuming, whether it's podcasts or YouTube or LinkedIn or Twitter or whatever. There's so many opportunities there, especially if you're already getting the people on stage. Like, you don't have to hunt them down again to do an episode. Like, you have the recording, just put it out. And especially for people in Canada, if they are tied to their operations so heavily that they can't, fly out to Banff and to actually be present in seats. I think it's super important. So I love that. And there's so many things in the content. I guess, like, you mentioned with me on our pre-chat that this is a timely event. This is happening at a pretty pivotal time within the Canadian regulation legislation era happening. I don't know if this is going to become a yearly thing for you, or if you're going to try to do this, but this first initial conference is super important for timing. Let's talk about that.
Yeah. So it's helpful, I guess, in a way that there hasn't been a big advocacy arm on a national level because we were able to pull in some relationships, and invite some folks that I'm friends with, and say, will you come to this? One of the things that I reached out to Minister LeBlanc about was the human trafficking component and all the work that Airbnb has done in Florida with our state initiative. And as I was doing podcasts about those components, everybody's linking back to the Florida course that's being done. So I was like, well, this is kind of silly, because I did one with Heather Bear, and I'm like, this is a Canadian podcast that is linking back to a Florida course. Like, there should be a Canadian course in both
Yeah.
languages. And so there were some timely pieces where this wasn't there yet. And so we were able to say, like, I think this is an issue. And because there isn't a Verma in Canada, there wasn't the lobbying being done. And so when I was talking to Minister LeBlanc's office, and I said, do you know there's a Quebec founded platform, We Chalet, that will be at the conference? And in Quebec, like, Quebec and Ontario kind of rule all of the elections just based on their populations. And they were like, wait, what? There's a Quebec what? We thought it was just Airbnb. And, you kind of love it when a governmental official is like, and I thought it was just Airbnb. Like, I thought that's what we were working on. It's like, no, you're talking about a Quebec founded business. And Airbnb was extremely helpful actually in saying there's actually five, and here's who you need to talk to, and these are the different components. So you've got provincial elections coming up where there's some territory seats that are going back and forth. You've got everything that's happening in BC, which they're hoping for and still hoping for a stay or a delay for the May 1st deadline of shutting down the short term rentals. And so our conference is literally right before that. And then it's a break week parliamentary. And so right after that, they're going to vote on the federal budget. That, if they take away the GST exemption or do anything with that GST exemption, because right now, the first $30,000 of revenue, you don't have to register for that GST license. So that has an impact no matter where you are in the country. And to be able to talk through some of those things. And again, one of the things I wanted to have was an infographic because everybody learns differently. I find politicians are more visual than others. So if you can see all the logos of all the different people that you're impacting, you're talking about Steve Davis, and I was talking to Steve a couple of weeks ago. Hub International is one of the sponsors because there's not a lot of brokers in Canada that are, national. And Steve was so caught off guard that I had Hub as a sponsor, and I'm like, well, as a broker in Canada, they work with Health Canada. Like that kind of made sense to have them. And so there are different property tech stacks or property management companies that have legitimized and professionalized their business. Where now, if you shut that down, you're talking about how supplemental health care for these where are they going to go for that? Where are they going to go for disability insurance and life? Like it's a lot more than just a bunch of folks that have a second home they're making money off of. This is a business that impacts your insurance companies and everybody else across the line. So I really wanted all those graphics to show them that because it is very different.
Yeah, and it's funny you say that because a lot of people, I think, either think it's just Airbnb there or it's just people that have a secondary home and they're just trying to make money and rake in as much dough as they can. And Colorado is going through a state kind of battle right now in the sense of the tax going from like 7 something percent to 27%, which is a 400% increase. And when I wasn't able to attend because we were both in Nashville at the Capitol. There was some people from Rent Responsibly and other things like that, and the Mile High hosts were advocating against it. And it's funny because I think a representative from Evolve, a representative from Vacasa, Verbo, Airbnb, they pulled the data, and 76% or 78% of the secondary, thirdary, for whatever, size homeowners were actually locals. They weren't out of state investors that were, buying properties here because it's a good deal and they can make a cash cow on. They were literally like, this is our retirement plan. This is our kids' college. This is our legacy to pass down. Uh, Traditions, many other things, and then locally, like so, like not only if you do this tax, you're not hurting outside investors, you're hurting locals that reside in your state. And so what you're talking about in the sense of like the health benefits and the what it's going to impact on the employees, there's so many layers to this and it gets so dirty that it not dirty, but it gets so messy in the sense of like there's so much to pay attention to. And I think a lot of
Yeah.
people, and there's people in our industry, I'm not going to give them any spotlight or glory on this show, but they always talk about advocacy in the way that you have to donate money. That's the only way you can be a part of advocacy, which is false in my opinion. What you're doing is a way to be a part of advocacy. Having the conversations on platforms like a podcast is a way of advocacy. There's many ways of advocacy, but there's so many layers. How are you keeping track of all of this stuff? Like, how do you, like, where, I think, like, how are you avoiding your attendees or anyone listening to this, like, getting an information overload? Do you think about that at all? Because I think about it. I'm like, man, I get overloaded. I get overstimulated. There's so many things to keep track of in your day to day business on top of regulation, safety, insurance, taxes, banking,
Mhm.
all the things. So I would love to know
Yep.
your kind of your thought process there.
So my personal belief system is that somebody has to hear something in one format or another, read it, hear it at least 5 times. And my goal is that you take away three things from each session that you attend. And if you can if you can establish 5 relationships at a conference, and, shout out to Julie George who posted the tips for going to a conference. I loved everything that she said. It was so valuable. I like to look at people ahead of time on LinkedIn and kind of, learn who I really want to meet so that I'm not just trying to figure it out in a room full of people. Each person has a different goal and a different objective, and I'm trying to boil it down a little bit. We've got different boot camps so that people can learn those components. Advocacy means a lot of different things. And I've done a lot of advocacy conversations with what does that look like? How does that feel? We just had regulations come in Florida,
I
and
was just gonna say yesterday, as, the recording is gonna go out a little bit later, but yesterday I saw this bill is now going up to Governor DeSantis, and, sounds really interesting. Like, I would yeah, that's
yeah.
crazy. Yeah.
Yeah, and so it's interesting because I was like, I try to be very careful. I have to be like a little bit bipartisan on my LinkedIn. But if you look at my LinkedIn, the number of politicians here locally that I'm connected with, I was like, "Oh, I can email them all, or I can just comment on this on LinkedIn because they're all connected to me." And it's all the people that are voting for it. The One of the neat things, I think, when you realize everybody is a person, right? Whether and sometimes you can, I think when you listen to podcasts, you can kind of get like a fandom fear where, oh, I don't want to approach Will. Like, that's he's so up there, and like, gosh, I don't want to interrupt him. He's over there talking to Steve Davis, and Steve's a CEO. I can't possibly go say hi, right? You get this sense. So I wanted to bring it down to like, these are all people, right? Whether you're talking about a politician or whatever, and everybody has the things they like, the things they don't like. And I think if you're on LinkedIn, it's really easy to find out like what are the things Catherine likes, what are the things Will like. We're very open about a lot of that stuff. Politicians are the same. And when you tap into the passion projects of what they're interested in, that was how I got the most amount of support from Airbnb, was because of how involved they've been here on the state level. And that's why I'm connected to so many politicians here, between Medicaid expansion, human trafficking, like some of these things where you're like, we're on the same page with this. And then that all of a sudden translated into me being able to get something done in Canada. And so it's a very small thing that you can do when you realize they're just people. And in the same way that if somebody saw me and they're like, "Oh, I don't think I could approach Catherine," I would be shocked, right? And you're the same. I mean, you're always so giving with your time. Anybody that comes up to you or reaches out to you, we're all people. And so I think advocacy is really important to bring down to that really basic level of it's human to human connection, say hi, like smile, those types of things. And I want to drill it down to that. And that's been one of the things that I've had to talk to a lot of the vendors about. Like, understand, for some of these people, the concept of going to a conference is brand new. And so they're not like, I've had more people reach out to me and say, like, what's the dress code? And because the fact that there were government officials coming, they're like, well, does that mean like I need a suit? Like, what do I need to wear? And it's like, no, we're just people. It's okay. We're gonna come together, and, you're gonna do you, and it's gonna be great. And we'll meet people that are, interested. The fact that they're coming demonstrates a level of interest. And so, I don't want it to be over anybody's head. I've spent a lot of time coaching the different speakers to say, like, don't take a canned presentation that you just gave at STR 12 and turn around and present this from stage, because it is very, very different.
Okay, the one thing that doesn't change with property management is that guests sometimes still like to party. They like to have a good time. They like to have loud music, smoking, partying, drinking, tons of people in the properties that shouldn't be there. Well, our friends at Minutes are on top of it. And as Airbnb recently announced, they have banned all indoor cameras of properties. Now they are all in favor with privacy safe devices just like Minute. And that's why Minute is here to make sure whether you're in Canada, you're in America, or you're anywhere else in the world, you have the best hardware and software to back you up as a privacy safe co host and property management tool that you can't live without. So get rid of those nasty, weird, creepy indoor cameras if you have them. If you do have them, we need to talk separately about some other issues. But get rid of all that stuff and trust in Minute and get with them today. 2 months free with the link in our show notes. I hope to see them at the CanStays conference here, and back to the episode. Yeah. No, 100%. And good on you for focusing on the content piece because I think in order for this to become a yearly thing, right? Like you have to make this so curated and so designed for the audience, and the audience is Canadian operators, owners, investors, etc. And so I think yeah, you've nailed it on the head. I would love to know just again, there's so many pieces involved, and it's so timely for this first one. Where do you think, like, what's the end goal? Like, in the sense of, like, what do you hope is the after effect? Post conference, you and I are back talking one on one. We're the stress has hopefully gone away. You know, all this stuff. Like, what's the end goal for this? Is this to become yearly? Is this to become a VRMA of Canada? Where do you see the big picture? Not only just getting this one event done, but moving forward as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's been the big call to action for everybody in Canada is what happens April 23rd. The conference ends April 22nd. What happens? And some of the fear has been like, Kevin, we know you don't live in Canada. So what happens on April 23rd when you go home? And so one of the things that we asked for was everybody from each province, if you could have sort of a voice because we're going to have provincial breakouts where we can form, not a formal board, but like an advocacy committee that is from coast to coast, all 10 provinces and the territories to say, this is how we're dealing with these different things from, Climate Canada's projecting a worse fire season than they had last year. How do you contend with that? What are the best practices around some of those concerns? And so we wanted the podcast to be recorded live from the conference because it would keep it going. Same with the Facebook page, Instagram, all the rest of it. We wanted to give the podcasters that are coming a list of Canadians that are interested in being interviewed and being able to tell their story. There's a couple of Canadian folks that want to launch their podcast from the conference and really speak to, what does that look like? How do you capture these audiences? So I actually had a call today. I haven't had a chance to text you about it, but I was talking to another podcast friend who was saying, we should do like all the podcasters together and talk
Yeah.
about and do a like a 20-minute. Well, we said 15-minute to start, and they said, well, we all like to talk too much. It'll probably be 20,
Yeah.
but put everybody up there and talk about what are the challenges, what are the advantages, how do you get on a podcast? Because I know in the Slack channel that I'm on with you and Mark Simpson and a bunch of the other folks, it's how do you do that? How do you reach out? Because I think I know I was very intimidated the first time I was on a podcast and thinking about like I'm just me with my 4 baby properties over here. Do I really qualify to be on your podcast? And that imposter syndrome can take over everybody. So we wanted to get some of those stories curated, launch it out. It should be an annual event for sure. I don't think it'll have the same governmental attention year in, year out. I think this year is the year because they don't really know what this is either, right? And there isn't a lobbying firm that everybody's been donating into. And I'm with you. Like that's one way to
For sure.
advocate. I would say in Canada, it is easier to advocate that way than it is in the US because there's campaign contribution laws that are very different. So you can only give $1,500 per year and there's no corporate donations. So there's a whole scope of like your $25 contribution in America goes nowhere. Like
Yeah.
nobody knows who you are,
Yeah.
right? But in Canada, it's like, oh, that's exciting, right? And so we're really hoping that this rolls forward and there is an advocacy component that does come out of this and teaches best practices. I think everybody has said if regulations haven't come for you yet, they are coming. And you've got the general population regulations. So carbon tax has been a big topic of conversation in Canada, whether you're a host or not. And then you get into some of the weedier things that can be provincial or municipal. What does that look like? Do you need a license? What does that application process go through? And I think the big call to action is for some of the folks that have organized, like Ontario has their Ontario Cottage Rental Management Association, and
Mhm.
then Quebec has their CITQ. They've organized and they know how to do that. Well, we want to share that knowledge with the provinces that haven't done that yet, that do need to do that and are worried about getting in front of things before it gets forced down their throat and they do have a chance to have a seat at the table. So the goal is really I think Canadians are unique enough to have their own definition, and I think this will roll into a Canadian movement of how do we solve these problems as Canadians because there are big challenges. Like, it's just it's different. They've gone through a lot of changes over the last year. You think about like content on Netflix and Facebook and all of those things. It's not You're not allowed to have the same content. I was trying to send the Airbnb commercial with the two different bedtimes, which I thought was a genius commercial, and I was sending it to a host friend of mine in Canada, and it was blocked. They can't view the content. So, like, as a marketing person, when you listen to that, you're like, I mean, how does that affect my ads, right? If I can't send that YouTube video. So they're unique enough that this is not a one and done. This is We're gonna establish relationships, we're gonna establish lines of communication that will roll in, year out. I think there's gonna be a lot of opportunity for vendors, for podcasters to, come into a market that they've sort of said, well, you can come here, but I'm not gonna come there.
Yeah. No, it's dang, I didn't even know some of that stuff. So that's like crazy to think about. I had a friend I sent a movie recommendation to in Australia, and she couldn't watch it because it wasn't on Amazon, or it was on Amazon, but she can't watch it. Anyway, so it's so mind opening to hear you talk about all this. It sounds like I just need to clear my schedule, and I need to put this on. Like I need to get there. It
Yeah.
sounds really interesting. I want to support you. So like, and also I want to say too, for all the listeners, if you knew the relationship that you and I had, like I'm so freaking proud of you, to be honest. Like from the day that I called you, like, hey, you should be at the Destination Air Awards. FYI, just you should be there. Uh to then you being so shy and like I feel like you just really come out of your shell and you really found your voice since the moment that we met. And I just am so proud of everything you're just charging after and really amplifying. Like you just become so so cool to like I don't know. I can't find words. I'm getting like that proud friend moment where it's just like you've really just went full speed ahead since the day that we met, and it's so awesome to watch. Like I am so proud of you. And so for people listening, like where can they go? Like I want to make sure we get this far and wide. Obviously, for all our Canadian listeners, you need to attend to this event. If you're not Canadian and you're a vendor or an operator, but have ties and feel like this is important for you too, you also need to be there. So where are we sending people, Catherine? I want to know like what's the place that we're taking them right now?
So on social media, it's the CanStays Rental Alliance. The conference is being held in Banff, Alberta, which is a destination in and of itself. So it's a super amazing place to go. But yeah, follow me on LinkedIn because all of my stuff is on there. As you said, the benefits piece in addition to this. But yeah, the CanStays Rental Alliance will give you a really good overview. It's on Instagram, it's on Facebook, and you can see the lineup that we have. We're announcing speaker after speaker, and I, I think it's a really great opportunity to network with a group of people that can help you see things from a different perspective. Even the hospital component, it may not apply to me as readily here in Florida, but I can tell you I took a lot of notes from Ben's website and the different things that he's doing. I'm like, that's a really interesting approach to fill gap nights. Like, okay. And yeah, so I'm thrilled to death. I'm so grateful to you for giving me the courage to launch everything. And it's going to be a spectacular conference. And it's one of those things that, I've it's terrible to quote an American in a Canadian conference that's focused on Canadian content, but the line from Hamilton where Aaron Burr says, "I want to be in the room where it happened." You want to be in the room where this happens. You don't want to miss this. There will never be a repeat at this level. The conference will go on, the movement will go on, but this year, you don't want to miss being in that room.
I love it. I love it. In order to have a seat at the table, you gotta be carrying around your chair, right? So, I love it. So, for all the listeners, obviously, you know the deal. Link in the show notes. Get your ticket, get your sponsorship, whatever it is, get to this conference. I'm gonna work after I hit end recording to figure out my schedule and just solidify that I need to be in Banff and just get this done because I think Yeah, everything you said, it's so interesting, and I think it's a new perspective and a new conversation that isn't talked about. We have very different content out here in America, and I think this is a great opportunity. So, Catherine, thank you for telling us all about it. For the listeners, all the links are in the show notes, from Catherine's LinkedIn to the event page to everything else for consulting work that she does as well. It's going to be there, so you have no excuse not to use it. Grab the links. And for all of our listeners, like always, we'll see you guys again next week. Thank you so much for listening, and thank you to our show partners for making Slick Talk, the hospitality podcast, possible. We hope you enjoyed the show, and we would love to connect with you outside of the podcast. So you can follow us on all of our social media channels for daily hospitality content, or find us on slicktalkthepodcast.com. And don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe so you never miss an episode. I'm your host, Will Slickers, and we will see you guys all again next week.